Good morning. It is 4:36 a.m. on Sunday, 19th of November 2017. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. Today is Sunday, so it is my rewatch series. I am watching episode 3 of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex titled A Modest Rebellion, Android and I. Just a note that I'm recording this very early in the morning because I am catching a flight shortly thereafter to travel home and visit family in Colorado. But in this Ghost in the Shell episode, we have another standalone episode. However, this episode starts doing something interesting wherein the characters, in maybe a slightly heavy-handed way, but that's fair because of them doing something unusual, start referring a lot to an event at the National Assembly building. And they keep saying, well, like, is this case related to that one? Oh, remember what happened at that event? Oh yeah, I remember the entire event at the National Assembly building. And everyone's talking about the event at the National Assembly building. But, it would be fair for us as the viewer to say, what event is that? That wasn't one of the previous 2 episodes, was it? No. What are they talking about? That's weird, right? Well, once we get into the complex episodes, we will learn. But it's interesting that it's an interesting way to approach it, I think, in a series like this, to have the characters start referring to something that we haven't seen yet, without really any indication at this point that we will be having that happen. But in any event, that's kind of an interesting quirk. The case that the Section 9 is investigating this time has to do with several units, all of the same model of Android, have started committing suicide. And, one of the newscasters later in the episode raises an interesting question, which is that although they're shaped like people, we shouldn't call it suicide because they are actually just sophisticated machines, and therefore maybe they're destroying themselves with aberrant behavior, but it's not suicide because they're not really people. And as with many Ghost in the Shell stories, the nuance of that question is examined in a thoughtful way and then left kind of unresolved, because there's some interesting back and forth in this whole little setup, and it's a nice little case of the week sort of thing. But again, we have some interesting stuff going on. We begin the episode after this initial montage of several of these androids killing themselves, and we have Aramaki going to interview the president of one of these of the manufacturer of the robot. Sorry, I'm very tired, you guys. Going to interview him, and the major and one of the Tachikoma go and sneak in and start analyzing computer records in a secret, invisible way while Aramaki is talking to them. And it's funny because it's just another bit of evidence in a way that's not really spelled out for us. We just observe it through action of, their Section 9 is prepared to think here that maybe something sinister is happening. So they just literally just go in and sneak in and steal files while Aramaki is talking to the president. But then when they realize, oh no, this is a virus that someone maliciously uploaded to their software and that's what's happening, the camouflage that Major and the Tachikoma were using to infiltrate. Just turn it off. It's fine. We're fine. Um, and that's interesting. So, like, they discover that it's a virus, but we also get a little bit of history of this particular model. What's the deal with this particular model? The model known as the Jerry's. They are popular because while they are obsolete in many respects, they're kind of clumsy and not very sophisticated given the level of Android capabilities that are, achievable in this time. Uh, they are very customizable by the end user, which makes them very popular for that reason. And what that reminds me of is the Sony PSP. Because its software and programming made it very easy to jailbreak those devices and customize them and do all sorts of pirate stuff on them, made that system sell a lot better than it might have otherwise. A lot of people bought it specifically for that reason. And while software makers might not like the people using the, you know, the software, the system to do software piracy, they nonetheless, it expands the user base in a dramatic way. So it's kind of like, well, is that a net positive or a net negative? Hard to say. It's complex. But in any event, we have to wonder, okay, so someone uploaded a virus that would make all of the Jerry units start destroying themselves. But they can tell based on analyzing the code of the virus that, they can tell. Boy, I'm having trouble focusing today. It's so early. They can tell by analyzing the code that whoever did the virus made sure that it wouldn't affect theirs. And it's about this point that we have our first scene of the culprits, so to speak, where we have a young man obviously in love with his Jerry, and also a film buff, and so he is planning to run away now that he realizes that they're tracing him and that he will probably be found. He needs to run away, and he wants to just be with her. And it's interesting that the Jerry that is with him is, as throughout the episode, she kind of just acts in a blank way, which is great for giving us this ambiguity. And it's the fact that he is into all of these French New Wave films and that sort of thing, like Breathless. It ties in sort of stylistically to some of those things where, the idea that if her facial expression is neutral and she speaks in a calm way, it leaves you with questions as to what is she really feeling? Is she feeling anything? Is she just an android? Or, as the company's vice president kind of jokes, are they developing a kind of soul because they're sad about being made obsolete? One thing I wanted to note a little bit is that I feel like the Major as a character sometimes in some iterations has a reputation for being kind of cold and stern, and I don't really know for sure where that comes from, other than the fact that when she's sort of on the job, she's very hyper competent. You know what I mean? She's very professional and takes it very seriously, the work. But we also see, in this series at least, frequently see her expressing humor and smiling and that sort of thing. Like when she notices, for example, that the Tachikoma that has accompanied her on this trip wants a souvenir from the trip. She's definitely amused by that and promises to tell it all the stories of her adventures. I'll tell you so many, you'll never want to hear another. And so that's kind of an interesting, you know, uh, dynamic there, and then also just in a weird little detail, when she goes to drive away, she just drives fast and completely recklessly. We see her force a police car to slam on its brakes as she speeds away, just out of nowhere, just because. I mean, and the thing is, they had to put that in, right? Like, that's not an accident. And so the idea that, she's off the job now, she drives the way she wants. She's got kind of an attitude to her. And then we get more of her being kind of reflective, thoughtful, even a little romantic in a slightly unusual way at the end of the episode, which we'll come back to. This is also kind of continuing the Tachikoma through line a little bit in the sense that they are definitely developing new behaviors. And they're, of course, just super cute, too. Like the shy way that the Tachikoma asks for a souvenir. But so we then have a couple of sequences of everyone doing investigation. We have Togusa and Bato doing. They're the ones that first of all they have a talk about. Well, why is this even a Section 9 job? Isn't this something that the local police could do? And they're not sure if it's maybe connected to this National Assembly building job, which, previously discussed. But Bato kind of suggests to him that it's like, well, we don't know, but it might be, and we, if it is, then we need to be involved, and if not, then we spin our wheels, and it's the joys of public service, as Togusa says. And they go and they clear the apartment, and we have a nice tense sequence of just them, infiltrating this apartment, and there's a bit about Togusa offering, like, he could have picked the lock and left no trace, but Bato is just like, yeah, that's an admirable skill, but it's just too slow, as he just forces the door open, breaking the lock. They discover, of course, that that's the right apartment, so that tells us the identity. This is a diplomat's kid. We get a neat little world-building detail that, he's the Canadian diplomat's kid who has fled to Japan to avoid the draft in Canada. And we're not told, like, well, what war is that? But, well, anyway. So that's how, they identify the kid. That's where they're creating, just pursuing the procedural. But we have then a conversation about the android in question with Togusa and Bato. And in fact, one of the things we can note too about Togusa is, as one of the least enhanced members of the team, we see that even just to access the computer data, he takes a device out of his pocket and puts it around his neck. So whereas other people will just connect their brain directly to a computer, he needs a device to do it. And they also talk a little bit about why would someone want to hang on to an old obsolete model of Android like this, not least get so attached to it that you feel the need to try to destroy all of them except your own. And, because it's, is that because wants them to be unique so that there are no others like it? Or is it to try to avoid competition for the spare parts? We don't know. It's not made super clear, although we could gather that it's maybe a combination of the two. But also Bato teases Togusa that about his revolver, in the sense of yeah, why would anyone hang on to an obsolete tool out of sentimental value? They also have an interesting discussion too, just in the sense of there's a discussion with them and the Major about what people would use these androids for, and she's kind of offended that the androids are kind of treated as stand-ins for slaves, for women slaves, in the sense that people have them because the way they want to treat them is the way they would treat a slave. And that's bad behavior, even if the android doesn't have its own rights. And there's also just kind of a general distaste for the sex slave aspect of that that could be interpreted. And Togusa and Bato briefly kind of have an exchange of like, the Major says that, but then dresses the way that she does, which is an interesting wrinkle to it, and I think we need more information. But just generally speaking, I think by today's standards, we can kind of say, well, let's not imply that the okay. I think the gist of what they're getting at is not that like by dressing the way the Major does that she's wants to be treated like a sex slave, but to be sure, she looks enough like a sex robot that when she is investigating suppliers of sex robots, one of them definitely attempts to buy her prosthetic body. And that's kind of left between the lines, but we see her looking annoyed as a nervous guy has offered her a bundle of cash. And then she just walks away, ignoring him. And that's just a little grace note in the middle of this larger investigation. But in any event, they track this guy down. They force him into the forest by hacking his GPS into thinking there's a construction area. And they eventually track him down. And it looks like he might force it to be a violent outcome. But then his android actually grabs his hand, his wrist, makes him drop the gun, and then restrains him and tells him that and quotes a line that we later realize is from a movie. According to the wiki here, it's from the French New Wave film Breathless, which I have seen Breathless, but not in a while. I didn't recognize the line, but part of what's happening too here is that we have a movie that's in French that could have been translated to English, and now we have a Japanese show that translated the line from French to Japanese, presumably, and then from the Japanese of the anime show into the English of the dubbed version. So it may be that the line is different than what we would see if we watched it with a subtitle, the movie with a subtitle, for example. But in any event, I'm getting close to my time. In any event, the robot restrains him, and it talks about, am I crazy? No, yes, and kind of going back and forth. I don't want to be in love with you. And then just what she whispers as they come up to arrest him is, I did love you once. And so later, after they arrest him, there's a discussion, first of all, between the Major and Bato of like, well, why did the robot do that? And why did he act the way he did? And Bato is kind of astounded that the Major, first of all, thinks that the way the guy was acting was kind of romantic in a weird way. Which, especially since she was so judgmental of him earlier, I think maybe her later impression that he's acting that way, admitting like, okay, the way he went about it was not good. It was malicious and it was criminal, and so we had to arrest him. But having him do it because he seemed to really actually be in love with her rather than because he wanted a slave, that didn't seem as bad. But why did the robot stop him? And it would be easy to just say, well, it's just quirk of the behavior. It's didn't have the virus, but it's an old robot modified who knows how, and it's weird. But maybe it was developing a little bit of a soul. Maybe it, maybe it was trying to keep him from ending it in a violent way. Did it really love him? Because after Togusa discovers that final bit of dialogue, it was reciting lines from a movie, which on the one hand it does sort of an interesting Lady and the Tiger thing, right? Because on the one hand, the android seems like it's displaying behavior like it has a soul or a ghost, by saying it loves him and acting this way, or is it just a quirk of programming? And then when he sees that it was just reciting lines from a movie, on the one hand, that makes it seem like, oh, it's just following some romantic pattern that it saw in a movie. But then he realizes that it added a line, that I did love you once was added. That's not in the movie that it was quoting from. Interesting. Also, although it's not made a big deal of in this episode, because it becomes kind of a through line for the Major's character, she tells the story about when she was first given a prosthetic body. It was hard for her to control, and she broke a doll in her hand. And we actually see that sort of briefly reenacted in the computer-generated opening sequence. We see a hand crushing a little doll. And we also see her playing with a fancy little lady's watch on her wrist in kind of a playful way. And it's not made a big deal of in this episode, but it's part of the through line, so I'll note it. And so I think that covers it for this episode. The next episode is called "The Visual Device Will Laugh Interceptor," and it is the first of the complex episodes. And so I'll be back next week on Sunday to discuss that episode. And in the meantime, I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes, and I'll be from Colorado.